The following content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not constitute means for diagnosis, healthcare advice, nor treatment. Make use of a qualified healthcare professional for such purposes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Charlene Ortiz, and today we're going to start a new lecture. This lecture involves aspects of motivation and emotion. Basically, what are the drives, the forces that allow us to conduct our behavior? So let's get started. Now, when we are talking about motivation, right? Motivation is any behavior. It's that force that allows you to have goal-directed behavior. Goal-directed behavior. Generally, when we are thinking about motivation, there are many different theoretical approaches, many aspects that attempt to explain where motivation comes from. What exactly leads to a goal-directed behavior, right? One of the first ones that I would like to talk about is homeostasis, right? Homeostasis. Some of you might have heard about this term before. Sometimes we use this term quite frequently in biological sciences. And it's not different here in the field of psychology. What we're trying to say is what drives you in order to have goal-directed behavior is that you're trying to find a physiological equilibrium, right? You're trying to find a physiological equilibrium, I should say. So, for example, let's think about when you are hungry, right? So, for example, you're hungry and you're trying to, okay, let me go to the vending machine, let me get up, grab my money, grab my wallet, grab my purse, and go and put money in that vending machine. That happened, that behavior occurred because you were seeking that homeostasis, right? So notice that what motivated you, right, to go to that vending machine was homeostasis. But you heard me talk about the term drive, right? You heard me talk about the term drive. And what do I mean by that? Drive is a hypothetical internal state. It is tension that it's motivating that organism, that person, that animal, that bacteria, and motivates that organism into engaging in said behaviors that would reduce that tension. What I am trying to do, it's basically that internal state, and it's pushing you into acting. So, for example, sometimes when you hear the term sexual drive, right? I have a sexual drive to engage in a sexual behavior. Notice that is a state of tension, right? The person has the need, that desire of engaging in a sexual act with the intent of having an orgasm, right? Because in that specific case, there is a sense of tension, and that tension would be released by engaging in a sexual act, whether it be masturbation, sexual intercourse. So notice that tension was that driving force. That's what led to the motivation of that organism, that animal, that human in engaging in a behavior. Because of that, those unpleasant states of tension are viewed as disruptions. They're viewed as disruptions. But notice that your intent is to maintain an equilibrium, right? Your intent is to keep a physiological equilibrium. So for example, if you're feeling tension because you are sexually aroused and want to engage in sexual activity, notice that feels like a disruption. So I have to take care of this issue in order to get back that homeostasis. The same would be in the sense of hunger, right? So for example, if you're hungry, that is a state of being, it's unpleasant, it is a disruption because you want to focus on the task in hand, but because you're hungry, you're unable to continue. So that is going to lead to that change in behavior to find that homeostasis. So any questions about that? Good deal. This one is perhaps one of my favorites, right? This one's perhaps one of my favorites, and that is incentive theories. But before we continue, we have to describe, because we're good researchers here, we need to define a term that is incentive. Incentive, right, is an external goal, right? An external goal that is going to engage, that's going to allow you to engage in that motivation for you to carry on with that behavior. Notice that in this specific case, there is some external stimuli, and this is very important. So whenever you hear incentive, I want you to hear external, okay? Because an incentive generally refers to an external stimuli. And I'll give you an example. If I were to ask you guys, why did you guys decide to go to college? A lot of you would say, especially those in the psychology field, generally you would say, I want to help people, or someone helped me, therefore I want to help somebody else, or I find it interesting, right? Now, that sounds a little bit more internal, but some of you may say, well, I decided to go to college because I wanted to have a good career, make some money, you know, get my toys, my car, my house, right, get nice things. Notice that that is an incentive because that is external. You're not going to have that inward, right, that inward factor. It's an incentive, right? You want to have a college degree, so hopefully you get a good paying job, and therefore that money becomes that incentive. That is what guided you to wake up today and show up to class, right? So that led to that motivation of engaging in a behavior. Notice that that particular case is external. I am driving, right? I am being pulled to act. So any questions about incentives? Good deal. Now, this one is also one of my favorites, and that is evolutionary theories, right? In regards to an evolutionary theory, when it comes to motivation, what happens is that we can understand how you are motivated because you've become adaptive, right? You're trying to adapt to a problem that has indeed been solved, right? It has been solved through human history. And one of the reasons I like this so much is because we can explain a lot of the behaviors that occur in regards to evolutionary theories. So for example, if you are going on a date, right? You're going on a date and you ask someone out, you didn't ask that person out just to ask them out, right? There was an evolutionary sense of flirting and courtship that is going to lead you to have sex, reproduce, and carry on with the species, right? So it's much more deeper than just, you know, texting someone, hey, you want to go out? There's more to it. That motivation that you had to text someone and have a date could be explained through evolutionary theory because you are adapting, right? You are adapting to the courtship behavior, and therefore that led you into having a date, perhaps having intercourse and continue the species, right? Now, remember, you could use the other two theories to explain that same behavior, right? But I do enjoy specifically the incentive and evolutionary theories that are immensely useful to define and to explain why is it that we engage in certain behaviors. Now, remember that in regards to motivation, even though they are somewhat different, so for example, the drive theories of, for example, homeostasis and incentive and evolution, notice that they are different, but we could agree that because behavior is so complex, we do have a wide diversity of motives. I don't want you to think that it's just these three, right? We do have a wide diversity. So any questions about that? Good deal. Now we talked about hunger as a driving force. We talked about hunger. That is because it in fact is. A lot of people, a lot of you go to work because you understand that if you didn't go to work, you will have nothing to eat. So notice that something as simple as getting in your car and putting in the key and driving to work, that behavior can be explained because of regulation of hunger, right? So let's talk a little bit more about the aspects that are involved in the regulation of hunger. One of the things that we need to consider is brain regulation. Now, what happens is that in our brain structures, right? For example, the paraventricular nucleus, it allows you to modulate hunger. What occurs is that you will have neural circuits that are immensely massive. And not only that, they are interconnected, right? They are interconnected. What occurs is that these circuits, not only are they massive, not only are they interconnected, but they are immensely sensitive to a wide variety of physiological processes. So because they are complex, because they are sensitive, kind of sounds like I'm defining your best friend, right? The one that's super sensitive and very complex. It almost sounds, but I am not. I am defining brain regulation when it comes to hunger, right? So because they are sensitive and they are diverse in regards to how sensitive they could be to these physiological processes, basically homeostasis could be impacted very quickly, right? It could be impacted very quickly, and therefore it's going to be a driving force into your behavior. We can also think about digestive and hormonal regulation. So if you look to the right of your screen, you notice that there is a wide variety of hormones, right? A wide variety of hormones that do in fact help you with the regulation of hunger. I want you to remember that we have, for example, hormones such as ghrelin, and what it occurs is that this particular hormone allows for the contractions of your stomach, right? That's responsible for that little growling feeling that you feel in your stomach, and therefore it promotes hunger. And if we go back to our drive theories, you'll recall that whenever we feel discomfort, we're trying to go back to that state of homeostasis. Therefore, we are going to start changing our behavior. So any questions so far? Good deal. Now, I want you to remember that there are hormones that both act in the short-term and the long-term impacts of the regulation of hunger. So for example, we have CCK, and that is basically responsible for letting you know that you have been satisfied, right? That you are indeed full, that you are satisfied, you have met this homeostasis, and therefore is going to reduce your hunger. Also, we have leptin, and what it occurs is that leptin is going to allow you to, with that long-term, right, that long-term regulation. It does take a while. It does take a while for our brains to be sent that signal that you are indeed satisfied, right? So a lot of people, if you're like me, I eat until I can't eat anymore. So the problem with that is that, if somebody puts, a 12-ounce steak in front of me, I'll eat the whole thing thinking that I have to eat the whole thing. When in reality, CCK is just taking a while to tell my brain, hey, she's full, stop eating, stop telling her to eat. So any questions about that? Good deal. Now, there are environmental factors, right? Environmental factors in the regulation of hunger. Some of them can be related to food availability, right? Food availability. Something that I want you to note, and we will view a short video about that, is that there are external factors, right? There are external factors that contribute as to when and how you eat. How do you meet that homeostasis? So notice stress can be a specific factor. And as I mentioned earlier, in my case, exposure to food. If I see food, I will eat it, right? I'm very inclined to, I see a plate of food, it's time for me to eat, irrespective of whether or not I am hungry. That has to do an awful lot with socioeconomic status. So for example, if you grow up super poor, you know that if food is in front of you, you will eat, irrespective of whether or not you're hungry, because food is available this moment. It is available right now, and you don't know when that next meal is going to show up, right? So another factor that could contribute into how much you eat is the presence of other people. Are you in good company, right? So if you're with your friends, if you're with other people that are eating a lot, if you are with other friends at the buffet, notice that perhaps is going to lead you into eating more, because you are indeed exposed to much, much more food. You're in good company, you want to stay there, and you're starting to eat more. If we keep along with the presence of others, notice that we can also have learned preferences. And in that case, if you remember from our previous chapters, you'll recall that we talked about classical conditioning, basically pairing a stimulus that should have been neutral, right? Pairing a stimulus that should have been neutral, and now you're pairing it with something else, either with something that increases the chances of you engaging in that behavior, or decreasing the chances that you will not engage in that behavior. So whenever we are thinking about that, I want you to think about if you go to a buffet, right? If you go to a buffet or you go to a restaurant and you associate like, oh, that cute waitress is there, or that cute employee is there. Instead of you associating the food with food, now you're associating food with something pleasant. That is going to increase the chances that you're going to eat. Conversely, right? If you were going to the buffet or the restaurant with a group of people that you love and you hang out with, notice that now you're not associating food with nourishment. Now you're associating food with a good time. And because of that specific reason, now you have a learned preference of eating habits. Basically, what I'm trying to say is don't eat and have fun. Basically, that's what I'm trying to say. I'm kidding. Go have fun. Go have fun. So I'm going to show you a short video of how these particular cues and these specific preferences that can be learned are impacted in your eating habits. All right. So in this specific case, this was a study in which a person was a Confederate, right? And they were dressed in, quote, a fat suit. So what happened is that we have a Confederate, right? She's wearing a suit. And in this suit is intended to make her look as she has a bigger mass. Notice that because she and these people were observing her behavior, notice that one of the things that occurred was that the people that were around her ate about 31% more pasta than the persons who were not around her at the time that she grabbed her food. Not only that, another thing that happened was that in this specific case, less people were likely to consume salad. So in this case, we measured the salad, and therefore we noticed that when she was around, individuals almost 50% were less likely. We had almost 50% more salad than we would have if she were not present. So notice that we have engaged in two factors. The first factor is because of her eating habits, we informed our own eating habits. Therefore, it is learned behavior. Not only that, in this specific study, another thing that occurred is that what I was talking about being in good company, right? Then we start associating Then we start associating that specific behavior, say perhaps because we are in good company. So now we're going to eat more, right? You went to the restaurant and now we are going to engage in more eating because we are in good company. Also, the appearance, right? The appearance of the person that is next to you can also impact the amount of food that you are eating, right? The perceived appetite that you actually have. So I do want to quote the persons who allowed us to view this video. Are there any questions about this specific phenomenon? Any questions? Good deal. So let's go back to our presentation. Let's go back to our slides. Let's talk a little bit more of obesity. Obesity generally refers to the aspect about being overweight. There are general rules of thumb as to the ideal weight that a person should carry. That, however, is impacted in regards of your gender, age, and racial makeup, right? So for example, perhaps for a smaller frame person, let's say an individual who is of Asian or Caucasian descent would be different, say, for example, a person of color. So for example, a Hispanic person or a Black or African-American person. Notice that race does also contribute in regards to body mass. So I don't want you to think, oh, this chart over here says that I am overweight or that I am obese. I don't want you to think that it does or does not necessarily apply to you, okay? Because there are other contributing factors. And again, I'm not a nutritionist, so I can't give you advice in regards to, or any medical direction, of course, but these are simply the presentation for how is it that our eating behaviors affect our behavior. Now, generally, when we are thinking about obesity, one of the measures that we utilize in order to understand whether or not a person is obese or overweight, I should say, is body mass index, Now remember, what this refers to is a weight to height ratio, right? Now, what we would do is divide your height and your weight divided by your height, weight divided by height. And again, remember, that is not the only factor. Your weight and height are not the only factors that contribute to your body mass. Of course, gender, age, and racial makeup can also affect that aspect. So for example, if right now I'm actually to the closer range of 200 pounds, believe it or not, I'm in like 190 range, but because I tend to have a big makeup on my shoulders and I used to be in the army and work in a prison, maybe being this weight is actually beneficial for me, having a big old frame, right? So notice that there are indeed some other factors that could contribute. Now, it is estimated that in the United States of America, about 35% of adults are obese, right? And obese generally refers to someone who is above 40 pounds, I believe, 30 or 40 pounds above. So not just overweight, a couple pounds, ranging in that 30, 40, 50 pounds overweight. So I would argue this number is probably higher if we look into persons who are overweight. So for example, I'm considered obese because I'm probably like a good 40 pounds above what my recommended weight is. All right, so any questions about that? I prefer thick, but obese is the term that people use. Now, there are many aspects that can lead to obesity. Of course, one of them is genetic predisposition. What happens with your hereditary factors, your predisposition, is what it occurs is that this is going to make you prone to obesity. It's going to lead to a predisposition. Notice that I didn't say it's going to cause your obesity. It's going to make you predisposed. And for those of you who are going to continue, say, for example, in biological sciences, in social sciences, that term predisposition generally tends to be confused with cause. I'm overweight, or I am depressed, or I have schizophrenia because I was predisposed to it, right? Genetically, my mom was schizophrenic, my dad was schizophrenic, my uncle was schizophrenic, therefore I shall be schizophrenic. Or my mom was overweight, my dad's overweight, therefore I shall be overweight. That's not necessarily the case because predisposition, it's only a prelude, if you will, right? It's going to be a factor that could impact that possibility, right? Although schizophrenia has a really high rate of predisposition, but notice it is not a cause. The same goes for obesity. So notice that terms matter, right? Specifically in sciences, right? Such as psychology, right? Because I'm not saying cause, I'm saying a predisposition. Because you are predisposed, therefore you may have a vulnerability, right? You may have a vulnerability to this condition. But this is the nature side of things. If we were to pair that with the nurture side of things, right? So for example, eating excessively because of the learned patterns that we observed earlier, because of the poor brain regulation, because of the poor learning habits, then we will start becoming more predisposed. We're going to start becoming more likely into having obesity, I should say. Another aspect that contributes for a person to be overweight is insufficient rest and inadequate sleep. Look at that. Isn't that relatable? Many of us do not sleep well, or if we sleep, it is inadequate, right? For example, it wasn't good quality, it was interrupted, or you woke up multiple times. So like, yeah, I was in bed 8 hours, but did I sleep 8 hours? Maybe some of you only need 6 hours or things of that nature. So sleep can also contribute as to if you are overweight or obese. Now, our body is naturally inclined to keep a weight that is very narrow. It is a very narrow weight. Now notice that we will have something called a set point, right? And that is your body's natural point of weight and stability, right? Weight and stability. So for instance, for some of you, you can say, I feel comfortable in the 200-pound range. Around 200, I feel bulky, I feel strong, but even though that may not be the necessary range for the average person, perhaps it is to you. I feel very comfortable in like the 130 range. Right now I'm in 190, so I'm pretty far from where I feel comfortable. But if I'm less than 135, 135, 130, I start feeling very sick, even though that is my healthy weight, right? That would be considered, 150 is my max generally. So 150, I feel okay, but I still don't feel healthy. So notice that my set point is actually very, very low. It's either very low or really high. So like what I have right now. So any questions about obesity?
BMI used often to figure out obesity?
Yes, it is the rule of thumb for people. So the question one is BMI what is used to determine obesity? Yes, it is generally the rule of thumb. But a adequate physician would also look into, say, for example, your racial makeup, right? Are you a tall guy? Are you a short guy? So a person can be 6'3". So one of my exes is 6'3", and he, according to the Army, had to be 185. That is immensely low for a person who's 6'3". I'm 190. So that gives you a general idea of how skinny the Army wanted him to be. So notice, yes, it is the rule of thumb, but is it adequate? And then we have to start looking into, for example, is this person a bodybuilder? Is this person required to have a big frame? So for example, for me, being in the Army and working in corrections, right? So yes, it is the general rule of thumb, but an adequate physician will look into, for example, okay, how's your cholesterol? How's everything else before saying, hey, you are unhealthy? They would then start looking into other factors. So your cholesterol, blood sugar, things like that. Does that make sense? I agree. It doesn't make sense that that's
also in at all flam or whatever.
right. So one good point that he just mentioned is whenever these scales were developed, they were primarily used with Caucasian individuals. By the way, the same thing happened with psychology. The disorders that we understood and defined when we're looking at upper class males that were Caucasian, that were wealthy, And then we started realizing that those scales didn't necessarily apply to the rest of the population. So that's why now we have multicultural psychology, and we're trying to do research considering those specific factors. But you're absolutely right. The scales that we tend to use today could have been impacted because of bias, right? We simply use one short and small sample instead of understanding the wide variety of individuals that could be impacted because of this measure. So you are absolutely right. That did.
It's also almost 200 years old.
Correct. And luckily now we have more research, but the thing about that is people like you, people like me, it's our responsibility to make sure that we have adequate measures, that we have adequate research for sure. All right, let's talk about one of the generally conceived driving forces. Let's think a little bit about the human sexual response. Now, in regards to sexual behavior, right? In regards to sexual behavior, you will notice that individuals tend to go through a aspect of 4 stages, right? So let's talk about the 4 stages of sexual response. The first stage is that of excitement, right? Colloquially, a lot of people use the term turned on as a colloquial term, but in science, we refer to this as excitement. What this refers to is basically when your muscle tension, your breathing rate, your heart rate, blood pressure, every single aspect starts increasing, right? It starts increasing very quickly. What occurs as well is because of all these factors that are being increased, you're also going to have vasocongestion. And what it is that your blood vessels start becoming really thick, start becoming really, really large. That occurs because, for example, the penis is getting ready to have an erection. And for females, what it occurs is that your vagina and your vaginal lips, your vulva becomes larger for the reception and penetration of an erect penis. So notice that it's the body's natural way of being engaged in this process, basically getting ready to engage in a sexual act. Now, when we are thinking about plateau, right? And some of you might have heard that term before in another context. Basically, plateau refers to that arousal, right? And it continues to build, but now at a much slower pace. So not as quick as that of excitement, but rather now it's a much slower pace. So for example, the person is engaging in a sexual act, whether it be masturbation or sexual intercourse. So notice that the arousal is still there, but it's building up at a much slower pace. However, once that pace starts changing, it eventually will reach a specific peak, right? And that specific peak is what we call an orgasm. An orgasm is basically the peak of intensity. So at first it was immensely quick, then it keeps going at a much slower pace, but it can only go up so much because it's going to reach an intensity. And what it occurs is an orgasm, and an orgasm in a very basic sense is a spasm, right? That's what an orgasm is, because you are having muscular contractions, right? That starts pulsating through your pelvic area. So basically an orgasm is basically a muscle spasm. That it allows for the contractions in your pelvic area, and therefore you will start having a discharge. Now, resolution refers to that physiological change in which sexual arousal tends to subside. And if we continue with the differences between males and females, something that I want to remind you of is that males, in regards to orgasm and resolution, if you recall from our very, very, very early lectures, we talked about that refraction period of a neuron, right? So for example, it reaches its action potential and then it falls down before it can actually reach back in that homeostasis factor, right? So something very similar happens to males. Once they become excited and are reaching plateau and reaching orgasm, they are going to go back to that resolution. With females, that is not the case. Females do not necessarily go back into that resolution status, therefore, or stage, I should say. Therefore, a female is able to have multiple orgasms because once she reaches the peak, she won't necessarily go to that resolution, but rather she can stay on this peak and keep having multiple orgasms as the sexual excitement and plateau continues. So that is one of the main differences in regards to the sexual stages between males and females. Of course, there's many differences, but in a basic sense, this is what it would look like. So any questions about that? Good deal. Now, interestingly, parents do not invest necessarily, right? Do not engage in the sexual behavior, right? When they are explaining the gender differences between males and females. And what do I mean by that in the Queen's English? What I mean is that parents do not engage or teach or promote certain behaviors with males as they would females and vice versa. The behaviors that they would promote in females do not necessarily represent those that they would teach to their sons, right? So the behavior would be different, right? As to how they engage and teach these specific factors. Now, notice that in the biological sense, right? In the biological sense, males generally would have a very small investment in the reproduction, right? So for example, after copulation, the biological investment for that reproduction was just semen, right? So it was only a short contribution. Whereas for females, they have a substantial investment, right? They have to be pregnant for 9 months, right? So in that particular case, there is a lot of energy. Of course, there is a lot of risk that can come from pregnancy. Now, in regards to the evolutionary significance between males and females, notice that in the evolutionary sense, a male, the intent of a male would be to seek more sexual partners, particularly partners that have a high reproductive potential. Now, if you remember from my previous slides, you remember, so what does that have to do with motivation, right? What does that have to do with motivation? When we were talking about theories, right? Theories that allow us to engage in a behavior, notice that males in an evolutionary sense will be prone to seek females that appear to be more reproductive, to have better capabilities. So for example, in this particular case, let's look at incentives, right? What is the incentive of looking for a certain type of people? Well, that she can carry my seed and therefore I would have more offspring. And then with the evolutionary theory, then the person is able to contribute to the species, right? So in lions, for example, I like to think about lions a whole lot. So lions, right, when we are thinking about some females, right, female lions would look for males that have very large mane, and they would have very dark and thick hair, because that is assumed that he would have the best sperm, because darker hair and darker mass and larger mass involves that he had better food intake, that he is stronger, that he can fight, that he can eat, that he has eaten better. Therefore, this female is going to seek that male that has that really large head of hair, if you will. And the same happens with humans, right? The same thing happens with humans. So for example, in thinking, well, this lady, she has large breasts and large hips. Generally, large hips involves better reproduction in the sense that she can carry and have less risk of, for example, having a miscarriage. So none of you are thinking about that consciously when you're flirting, but notice that we are evolutionary inclined to look for certain types of females because that is associated with a greater chance of reproduction. So in that sense, males will be prone into seeking some specific type of females. By the same token, females tend to maximize, right? Females tend to look for individuals who are willing to invest, that are willing to invest resources, right? So for example, in some bird species, you'll notice that the female will wait for courtship, and then some of the males would start bringing them leaves, right? And start bringing them twigs, fruit, colorful things, because the male is trying to show, hey, I can invest in this relationship, right? I can be a good father, if you will. So now it's showing, the animal is showing all that investment that he could make should she carry its offspring, right? And the same thing happens with females, right? That there will be a chance that a female will look for males that can provide an investment. Again, I don't want you to think this is Dr. Shar's opinion, right? I don't want you to think, oh, Dr. Shar said that if men only look for women with big hips and that women are only interested in how much men can spend on them. That is not what I said. In an evolutionary sense, that would make sense, right? Because that's what we see in animal species. But I don't want you to think, oh, that's what she said, right? No. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that in an evolutionary sense, it makes sense for the adaptation and reproduction. Now, lastly, because we are trying to maximize and find many sexual partners that have a high chance of reproducing, right? In the sense of males, generally in the behavioral outcome is that we would find a less committed sense of sexual relationships, right? So what it means, if I'm less committed, I have a greater chance of reproduction and a greater chance to find a female that could reproduce. Because remember, women can only have children every 9 months, whereas a male can technically have a child every day, right? If he can make a child every day. So notice that in the sense of males, a male could likely try to seek more sexual partners because a female can only reproduce so much, whereas a male could reproduce many times a day, whereas females can only reproduce only once every 9 months. Now, generally, what happens is that for females in the animal species, what tends to occur is they would generally have a smaller number of sex partners because a female can only reproduce so much. So they were looking for things such as ambition, looking for status. That ties back into the resources for the offspring, looking what could be the larger contribution for the children. So any questions about that? Good deal. Good deal. All right. Now, when it comes to sexual patterns, there is much difficulty I've had to point out, and it wouldn't be adequate of me of saying, oh yeah, data is super accurate. The problem with gathering differences in patterns of sexuality is that a lot of people are reluctant to report real results, even when it is completely anonymous. People have a hard time responding and letting us know some information about their sexual partners or sexual activity, because there's many reasons to that. First of all, they would be worried that their information is going to be disclosed in any way, even though we guarantee confidentiality or anonymity. Or it could be because it is hard to admit. How many sexual partners a person has had. Women tend to underestimate and men tend to overestimate how many people they've had sex with. So it is really, really difficult, very, very difficult to gather accurate data when it comes to these differences and patterns, but nonetheless, this is generally what it looks like. Generally, in an individual, we are looking at individuals who rated their sexual patterns as a 6 or greater. In that sense, males generally express a greater interest in sex. Now notice that in the younger range, right? So for example, 25 to 54, notice that they're pretty similar, right? They're pretty similar when it comes to their interest in When we are thinking in that specific gap, yes, notice that there is less of a gap in that reproductive stage. I would argue it's because this is a reproductive stage and it shows a greater interest in sex. But as years go by, the gap gets larger. So for example, the gap here is not that large, but then as we start getting older, the interest, notice that for all of them, it starts receding, but the interest starts receding much quicker. This gap is much wider as we tend to age. Now, I do want to remind you, as generations go by, women have had the opportunity to be less judged when it comes to their sexual interests. So as years have gone by, as generations have gone by, those gaps tend to decrease, right? So I do want you to remember that, even though there is a larger gap, notice that as generations go by, females themselves are more receptive to their own sexual experiences, and society as a whole has also become more receptive of female sexual expression, sexual behaviors, or sexual identities. So yes, there is a gap, but I want you to remember that it is getting better, right? It is getting better. A lot of it has to do with research, right? Back in the day, in Victorian times, when a woman was considered hysterical, how many of you have heard about that before? Oh, right. So back in the day, we used to think that women were angry because they couldn't orgasm. So they would go to a physician's office and they would have a vibrator at the medical office to give her an orgasm. So she would tone down her hysteria. But now we know that it's not necessarily the case. We know that medical advances and also psychological advances have led us to have other perceptions when it comes to sexual behavior. That's a fun little fact, by the way. You can Google this. You can Google that. That's an actual fact. That's what we used to believe back in the day. So let's continue on with our slides. Now, this here gets confused so much, and I hope after this class, it becomes really clear. All right, so sexual orientation. What is sexual orientation? Sexual orientation is a preference. Notice that I didn't say who you have sex with. I did not say that. The preference, right? Your romantic and sexual preference of individuals who are of the same sex, other sex, or either sex, right? Sexual orientation in a very basic sense refers to who are you romantically and sexually inclined towards. Notice that I didn't say that you have sex with, right? Because sex is a behavior. Sexual orientation is not a behavior. Sexual orientation is a preference, right? It's what you are romantically and sexually attracted to. You will see that a whole lot in practice, a whole lot, with all generations, quite frankly, with your older patients, younger patients, and children patients, that they simply confuse the terms of sexual orientation and saying, well, I'm not really gay because I've never had sex with a man. Well, sex with a man is an action. It's a behavior. Sexual orientation is not an action. It's a preference, right? So in this particular regard, remember, that is not a behavior, right? Because, for example, think about if we go to any prison right now, any sort of prison, and male, female, juvenile, it won't matter, whichever prison, and you were to ask these individuals, the vast majority of them are going to identify as heterosexual, meaning that they are interested in members of the opposite sex. But if you ask them, how many of you are having sex in the prison? A lot of them are going to tell you they are, but they won't claim that they are gay, right? Because their sexual orientation, their sexual preference, and the romantic preference is not that of the same sex. So when we are talking about heterosexuals, right? When we are thinking about heterosexuals, we are thinking about the term colloquially expressed as straight, and when we are looking for emotional sexual relationships with members of the other sex. Now, a person who is bisexual generally seeks and has a preference for the romantic sexual aspect of people from either sex. Now, this term here is a dated term. Now we don't use the term homosexual. And why is that? Well, we don't use the term homosexual anymore because homosexual refers to a mental illness, right? And that has been taken out because of research. We understood as we kept doing research that homosexuality is not a mental illness, it's not a mental disorder or defect. It is not, it's a part of sexual preferences. So now we don't utilize the term homosexual, now we use the term gay. And when we're thinking about gay or lesbian, we are referring to a person who is romantically, emotionally, sexually inclined with members of the same sex. So I do want you to remember that this term was defined in terms of a mental illness. So because we understand that being gay, straight, bi, pan, whichever definition, notice that they are not considered mental illnesses anymore because we conducted research and over time we understood that, as you know, science, the good thing about science is that it can be revised because it's not dogma, so we can revise science. And because of that, we know that homosexuality, as we used to define it back then, is not accurate, is not a mental illness. So, any questions about that? Good deal. I do want you to remember, I know that that will be a little bit more in-depth, but sexual orientation is different from gender expression, is different from gender identity. These are very different terms. They are not synonyms. And in other chapters, we will cover them a little bit more in detail. Now, Kinsey. Who was Kinsey? Well, Kinsey was a very, very interesting person. He was one of the first people that conducted psychological and physiological studies of sexual behaviors in general, right? Not only gay and straight, just sexual behaviors in general. And what he did, he recruited people like you and me, students, people who were from the street, participants, willing participants, anybody that he could basically get his hands on, because back then it was very, very difficult. And today it is still very difficult to study sexual behavior. So one of the things he would do, he would record people having sex, right? His own students, people who were participants, right? And he will record, for example, all of those stages that I mentioned earlier. So for example, excitement and the rest of them all the way up to resolution. And he was one of the first people, right, that scientifically documented this type of behavior, right? Because before then, we didn't have a lot of scientific knowledge. We knew it existed and we knew it was there, but it wasn't studied of depth. He, however, had a lot of ethical problems, right? His studies were met with a lot of ethical concerns. For example, recording your students having sex and sitting there while, you know, they're having sex, that might not necessarily be the best thing, wouldn't it? So a lot of ethical problems. He did come across a lot of ethical problems, but he also looked into sexual behaviors, sexual dysfunctions, illnesses and mental illnesses that were related to sexual dysfunction. So notice that he did contribute immensely. And that's one of the reasons why we still talked about him today. Now, one of the things he's mostly known for, although I would like him to be known for the other things that he did. One of the things he discovered, right, is that people tend to define their sexual orientation based on a progression, if you will. It was basically a continuum. So one of the things that he noted when he was studying different participants is either that they were exclusively heterosexual, meaning that they had no emotional, no romantic, no sexual interest with persons of the same sex. But as that continuum progressed, we also noticed individuals who would define themselves as gay, meaning that they were only romantically and sexually, emotionally inclined to people of the same sex. But notice a lot of people will look at this scale and start thinking, where am I at, right? Where do I fall, right? So for example, do you incidentally only have thoughts and interests in people of the same sex, or more than incidentally, equally, right? So for example, he would start looking more into the bi side of things. And then also for persons who identify as gays, like every now and then they do have a romantic or sexual interest in peoples of the other sex, and then exclusively gay or exclusively lesbian. So any questions about Kinsey? There is an excellent movie about him. I would love to show it in class. I cannot show it in class, but it is a very, very interesting movie. If you can get your hands on that movie, it's very interesting. Of course, it's Hollywood, so you know that it's going to be portrayed in a way that might not necessarily be accurate, but it's pretty good. It's pretty good. He had the chance to study about 20,000 individuals. That is a whole lot of people. That's more people than some towns have people in it. So that was immensely, immensely interesting in his field. Now, there are many aspects, right? There are many aspects that we use to explain gay or lesbian behavior, right? Now, there are some aspects when we're looking at the personal history of persons who identify as gay. So, for example, one of the things that we think about is, well, my boy, was extremely feminine, right? Or my girl was extremely masculine. Notice that one of the things that we would believe is that that particular behavior when you're a young child, and I'm talking about months, I'm talking about young, that behavior could predict subsequent development of being gay. Now, generally, most gay men and women would report that they would have that sexual and emotional interest way back in their early childhood. So they were already interested in people of the same sex back when they were children, right? They had already noticed that interest in the same sex. And another aspect is that most gay and lesbian women report an immense struggle, right? They report an intense, active process to deny their own sexual orientation, right? So those are some of the themes that we can find, or we can expect to find with persons that report being gay or lesbian. And some of you may think, well, I don't remember, I don't remember any of that. I don't know how a child can know that they're romantically and sexually inclined to someone. I want you to think about the very, very, very first time you liked a boy or you liked a girl, or you started noticing guys or started noticing girls. A lot of you had these little interests in, oh, that boy's kind of cute, that girl's kind of cute. And you were like, what, 6, right? So notice that in early childhood, right, we start developing an interest. The thing is, a lot of you don't know what that was at 4, 5, 6, but that is your inclination, right? Even at a young age. Sometimes I'll hear people say, well, that's what they learn. Actually, research shows us that you cannot teach gay and you cannot teach straight. So research shows that we cannot change and teach people to be gay or straight. It simply does not occur. And why is that? Well, it is because we also have biological aspects. There are biological aspects of being gay or straight. There is a genetic predisposition as to whether or not a child will be gay or straight. We do have a predisposition. Now, remember that earlier we used the term predisposition. Like I said, predisposition doesn't mean cause, right? But there is a contribution, right? It could be a contribution for gay or lesbian, bisexual, straight orientation. It is noted that sexual orientation has a hereditary factor, right? There is a hereditary factor of being gay, straight, or in this case, we're only talking about gay and lesbian, bisexual. There is a hereditary component of people being gay or bi. And notice that it's not different for men and women, that there is a hereditary factor of being gay and being bi. And it's not different, right? It's not that if men have that hereditary factor, that it is more likely that men will be gay, or if women have that factor, that is more likely that they will be lesbian. It's about the same. So if you already have that genetic predisposition, it's likely that one of you will manifest in such way. So a lot of the contributions for this, if you remember from earlier lectures, we talked about twin studies, right? If you recall, we talked about twin studies and twins that lived in the same household or twins that were adopted. So we know that the chances of you, for example, having a twin and your twin being gay or your twin being lesbian, that increases the chances exponentially of you yourself being gay, because there is a hereditary component. It is in your genes, right? So there is a hereditary component into being gay or to being a lesbian or being bisexual. Any questions about the hereditary predisposition of being gay or lesbian? Good deal, good deal. There is another biological component that can contribute as to whether or not a person being gay or lesbian, and that is prenatal hormones. Prenatal hormones. What do I mean by that? In the womb, there are hormones as the woman is pregnant. That balance of hormones in the woman's womb can contribute whether or not a person is going to be gay, lesbian, or bisexual, right? So before you are even born, there are hormones and the balance of said hormones that would guide you into being lesbian, gay, bisexual, or any other, I should say, sexual orientation, right? So before you were born, you will have perhaps hormonal factors that contribute. A lot of it has to do with testosterone. There's more, of course, but a lot of it has to do with testosterone exposure in the womb. So that's also a hereditary, I should say, a biological component of sexual orientation. And of course, one of the last things that I like to mention is that sexual orientation tends to be more fluid in women than it is in men. However, I want you to take this with a pinch of salt. And why is that? That is true for Western countries, right? The book doesn't mention that, but that is true for Western countries. So for Western countries, for example, America, Western Europe, UK, France, Spain, that fluidity with women and their sexual orientation, it is true that it's more malleable, more fluid with females, but I want you to notice that that is only in Western cultures. If we start looking at Eastern cultures, African cultures, it's about the same, right? So the same concerns that we would have here with men who identify as gay or bisexual will be the same as women who identify as gay and bisexual. Say, for example, Middle Eastern countries, African countries, Southeast Asia countries. So it does mention that, but that only really applies to Western cultures. It's really not the case for any other place, really. So just Western cultures. So any questions about that? One of the things that I like to think about whenever I'm teaching this chapter is that it allows people to think a lot, right? It allows people to think about, okay, so when did I start becoming attracted to men or women? I noticed most of you, I would say, well, I was really little. You know, I started liking little Becky in like first grade. I thought, you know, she was my girlfriend or something like that. Or I started really liking my male teacher back then. So notice that interest does start manifesting itself very, very, very early on, even as toddlers, right? The preference in toys. So for example, females who are inclined with playing with stereotypically male toys we can use that as a predictor for lesbian or bi behavior later on, and the same thing with males. However, remember that it is only one factor. I don't want you to say, oh, Dr. Shar said that because my little brother is interested in girl toys, that means he's going to be gay. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there is a predisposition. Yes, ma'am.
How does asexuality go into the whole discussion?
So how would you guys define asexuality? That's interesting. Yes, ma'am.
Not having interest, asexual would be like no sexual interest in any gender, but there's aromantic. Yeah, I heard they separated the two. So aromantic, you don't have any romantic interest, but you can still be sexually active with others.
So when it comes to asexuality, if we go back to Kinsey's, right? If we go back to Kinsey's studies, think about where is that romantic or emotional interest, right? So it still classifies as a sexual orientation. And a lot of people like to define asexuality as like nothing. They're just nothing. Well, it's not just nothing, right? There is generally a romantic component to that. It will fall in the same sense. I would like to investigate it at an individual level because different people define asexuality differently. So for example, if I have a client that identifies asexuality as like, I have no interest, right? I have no interest with anybody. I would like to explore that a little bit deeper, right? Because it could be, say, for example, I don't want it to be a result of trauma, right? So I would like to explore that. I'm not saying asexual people are traumatized. I'm saying I would like to explore that a little bit deeper with that specific person before I make any assumptions. And that's good practice with anything, really, anything mental health. You want to explore it with the person that is sitting in front of you and not with the information that you had on a textbook or a slide. So you would want to explain that a little bit deeper. Any other questions? All right, beautiful people, and I'll see you Wednesday.